Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another webinar series. I am happy to be your host again today. My name is Kara Oosterhuis, and I'm the Western Canadian Agriculture Field Editor at RealAgriculture. I'm pleased to host today's webinar, as I said, for the Simpson Centre for Agriculture and Food Innovation and Public Education at the School of Public Policy. Thank you very much for joining us. We wouldn't be able to do these webinars without you guys, so we really appreciate your participation, your viewership, and anything you want to bring to the table. So today's guest is Robert Falconer, and he has a sneak peek of a soon-to-be published paper by himself. If you have any questions for our guest, feel free to put them into that Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to them once Robert has finished his presentation. But as I said, if you have any questions while he's speaking please put them in, and while they're fresh in your mind, and we will get to them as soon as possible. So Robert Falconer is a researcher at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, Social Policy, and Health Research Division, specializing in immigration and refugee-related issues with an interest in poverty and housing. Robert holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Calgary, where he completed a capstone research project surveying the refugee housing affordability in Calgary and offering recommendations to improve affordability. He also holds a Bachelor of Arts, and he had an honors in that, from the University of Toronto in anthropology. Previous to his current work, Robert was a frontline worker at the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, a nonprofit focused on the settlement and integration of refugees and immigrants in Calgary. Robert, we're very much looking forward to your presentation here today, and I will let you jump in from here.
Thank you, Kara. Happy to be with everybody today. As Kara mentioned, today's presentation is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be on the topic of an upcoming paper. If you've been here for our previous ones, we've talked a lot about the recent situation with migrant farm labor in Canada, in the agriculture sector, as it relates to COVID-19. Today's topic is going to touch on that a little bit again. We're going to go over, for those of you who were at previous webinars on this topic, some of this will be somewhat familiar to you. But what we're going to talk about today as well is the topic of an upcoming paper, which is going to talk about sort of a world, as it were, after TFWs. To clarify, this is not something that we know is going to happen, but there's been perhaps some discussion with the recent events of what does the employment of migrant workers look like in Canadian agriculture following COVID-19, and what steps should we take perhaps to address the issue of migrant farm labor and domestic labor in Canada in our food production sector following the pandemic. Are we over-reliant on TFWs? Should we perhaps consider an alternative model? And what would be the impact of that model? I want to clarify that right up front here that this paper still is somewhat in progress. So actually any feedback that people might have following the presentation is of course more than welcome. But we are going to start off here. I'm just going to switch over and start showing my slides here. And for those of you who were at our last presentation, some of this might already be familiar with you. And by the way, if I am displaying, I always have to ask this question, if I'm displaying the presenter mode versus the presentation mode, please let me know. But otherwise, happy to be here today. Okay, so title of today's presentation is Product of Canada, Labor Trends and Capital in Canadian Food Production. When we talk about Product of Canada, we do produce a lot of our domestically consumed food products. But when we consider the role of migrant and international labor in harvesting and processing those food products, we have to consider that this is really a globalized project, even if it is occurring within our borders. A bit of a roadmap for today's schedule is going to be, first I'm going to provide you some context. This is where I said that first, those of you who are at our previous presentations on this topic, some of these slides might even be familiar with you, but I feel it's important to provide an update on them, given the evolving situation with COVID-19 and food production, and because I think they serve as the basis for our for the rest of the discussion. So we're going to start off with some context. We are then gonna talk about improvements or developments in the sector since COVID-19 has happened, and then we're going to talk about the long-term questions that have been raised by the pandemic. Also, we're going to talk about improvements that have been made to protect the safety and conditions for workers during the pandemic. So we're going to go through very quickly some of these slides. If you want more context on these ones right here, I encourage you to actually go back to our previous presentation on this back in August, where we sort of covered the employment of TFWs within Canada. Right here, more than anything, what I wanted to point out was that TFWs have come to play an increasingly large role in our food production sectors. And I'm going to use two different terms here throughout this presentation. One is food production, the other one is food manufacturing. Food production is the direct cultivation and harvesting, fishing, direct raising of cattle. It's sort of that primary agricultural step, and food manufacturing is that when it goes to the processing plant to be cleaned, packaged, and shipped. So two things. One is that that TFWs plays a very large role in both food processing or food production as well as food manufacturing in Canada. They do a lot of work on our farms, on ranches, and especially, as you'll come to see here, in greenhouses and in floriculture. But also increasingly so, they're playing a large role in our food manufacturing sector, both in food transportation as well as food processing. That is in meat, seafood, also in other forms of food processing, such as sort of juices, grains, etc. This does, of course, vary by province. Again, for those of you who were at our last presentation, this will seem familiar. It wouldn't be to surprise nobody that that in Atlantic Canada, TFWs are especially employed in our seafood manufacturing plants. As you start to move out east into central Canada, or sorry, move out west into central Canada, into Quebec and Ontario. Heavy presence in our farm labor, and we'll clarify a little bit later on that specifically is heavy in nurseries, greenhouses, and floriculture. And then as you move out further west, you start to see a bit more presence in Manitoba and Alberta, especially in our meat manufacturing. Now, this was the situation in the early spring, and I think it's important that we go back to this one right here, because what we saw early on in the pandemic in March and April and May was a significant decline in the number of TFWs arriving in Canada. This was mostly due to travel restrictions put in place by the federal government early on in the pandemic, also moves by certain provincial governments, especially New Brunswick, to limit the entry of TFWs into the province in the hopes that it would limit the spread of COVID-19, as well as induce industry to hire more unemployed Canadians. The relative impact was most heavily felt in the seafood manufacturing sector, where they experienced a 60% decline in the number of TFWs arriving that year, but also in meat processing and in farm labor. Transportation was largely unaffected because right off the bat, when travel restrictions were first announced, there was already written into them an exemption for TFWs working across international borders. So that was never really an issue there. Fast forward to today, and the situation has changed somewhat. Farm labor is still down relative to the last year, about 7%. Same thing with fish and seafood processing. Meat and poultry processing has recovered somewhat, although it is somewhat late into the year that recovery really began. This recovery has really been about the continuing arrival of TFWs throughout the summer, well after perhaps the initial period in which a lot of meat processing would occur. Food processing has actually been up above last year, but again, this is sort of towards the latter part of the summer, early part of fall, where the arrival of TFWs finally surpassed the number during the same period last year. Okay, we're going to jump back a little bit into Canadian history here for a bit, because again, I think it sets the context for today's conversation. If you were at our last presentation, a major theme of what we talked about here was the consolidation of Canadian agriculture into a more industrialized, mechanized, and corporate sector. What we're seeing here, this is the number of farms, it shows the blue line, starting in 1871 going through to 2016. in contrast to the orange line, which is the amount of cultivated farmland, which is in millions of acres. What we began to see here, and again, if you want more context on this, please refer back to our previous presentation, was that following World War II, there began a very strong consolidation of Canadian agriculture. The numbers of the amount of farmland being cultivated in Canada remained largely static from the late 1940s through to 2016. But the number of independent outfits has dropped considerably. What this has meant is that as the number of farms have decreased, if you look down there on the x-axis, that's the horizontal axis, as the number of farms has decreased, the average area of farms has increased considerably. Again, the way I talk about this is that when and as you'll see going forward, is that when a family leaves a farm and sells it to another farmer, that new farmer doesn't necessarily get to keep the family and their labor. So their farms are bigger with less workers. The distributional impact, though this is somewhat of a new slide from our previous presentation, shows that this phenomenon is actually not something that's been replicated across Canada equally. Out east in the Atlantic, you've seen farmland taken out of production, period. The number of farms have decreased, and while there's been some consolidation there, by and large, not only have farms shut down, but also the land that was previously being used, that was previously productive, has also been taken out of production as well. In Quebec and Ontario, this has occurred to somewhat less extent. Ontario and Quebec still remain large centers of agriculture in Canada. And again, there has been some consolidation there, but still through the growth of centers like Montreal and Toronto especially, as cities have pushed out their limits, not only have we seen some consolidation, but we've also just again seen land taken out of production in those provinces. The consolidation story is especially strong in the prairies. It's really Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta where this story of an industrialized agriculture really takes place. BC is a bit of probably one of the more interesting stories here as well, where actually farmland has actually increased since the 1940s. The number of independent farms has dropped through to about the early 1960s when it remained relatively static. And what this was a result of is the arrival of large numbers of especially families from East India into the tree nut, fruit, and melon sector in British Columbia, where not only did that sort of offset the drop in independent farms, but also has resulted in the cultivation of new acreage in BC as families have started to grow outfits like orchards and other fruit-producing outfits. Going forward here, sort of this drop in consolidation in Canadian agriculture that you see here has been driven largely by the exit of small farming families from the sector. The red and the purple lines here show the drop in own account farmers. Those are farmers who own their own outfits as well as don't really employ a lot of outside labor. That's the drop in small independent farmers and also the drop in unpaid family members working on farms since the 1940s. During that time, the number of domestic employees, the number of employers has actually remained relatively static. In fact, there was actually some increase in the 1980s and early 90s. And while there has been a little bit of decrease, that's actually largely occurred rather than a long-standing trend occurred since the financial crash of 2008, which might have spurred further exit of employers in this field, and with the exit of employers, some exit of employees as well. But then again, I want to reiterate that the big phenomena here that we're seeing is the I don't want to call it the demise, because they still comprise a major part of Canadian agriculture, but we're seeing the drastic reduction in small independent farmers and the involvement of family members on farms really since the 1940s. Now, what can be done about this? And this is where we're going to start to shift into, we're still going to provide some context from previous presentations here, but we're going to start to shift into how do we address this, and what does this look like in the future, and what's the potential impact? Well, one way to address this is to mechanize. And I want to emphasize that this is actually a trend that is already ongoing. Since the 1920s through to 2019, the mechanization of Canadian agriculture has been has been a pillar of development in the sector and increasing its productivity. The value of farm equipment, specifically on farms, this is not land, these are not buildings, this is actual equipment, has gone up considerably. I just display the employment of tractors on farms. While it's certainly not the only piece of equipment on farms, it is of course one of the more visible and more representative of the agricultural sector that we consider. And when we consider the fact that a tractor today and a combine today looks very different than a combine and tractor of even 20 years ago, with the employment of GPS technology and other technologies as well. I want to just emphasize here that capital investment in technology is a major part of Canadian agriculture. So, major response to this, the labor shortage caused by the exit of small farming families has been capital investment. When it comes to labor, it actually varies considerably by sector. This figure here, this is a new one, shows the measures taken to manage staff requirements on farms by farm type. This is where you start to see things really break down by industry. When you look at certain industries like beef and forage, when you're looking at actually on farms, there's a good majority of them aren't actually experiencing that much in terms of labor shortages. For those that do, there tends to be an emphasis on working overtime. I don't think that'll be a surprise to any farmer here in the room or anybody who's worked on a farm that overtime, it remains a big part of all sectors. But again, the number one response among beef, poultry, forage, other sectors where there's not a lot of difficulty filling labor requirements, when there is a difficulty, the instinct is to turn towards just working more and working longer hours. This does, however, start to shift when you start looking at sectors like dairy, and especially fruits and vegetables, berries and nuts. Dairy as well as fruit and vegetable sector, both have expressed that the majority of outfits there are experiencing significant labor shortages. The response there has been to invest in technology, to work in overtime, but especially when you look into the fruit and vegetable sector, it's also been to turn towards employing temporary foreign workers from abroad. When you break this down by province, it also varies considerably as well. If you're seeing a gap in some of these, it's nothing to do with the graph, it's due to the lack of data for that particular province. Looking over into the prairies, again, most prairie provinces aren't experiencing a major labor shortage, and that's because of the presence of the large animal production sectors here. When you start to get over into British Columbia, a little bit into Quebec and Ontario, and over into the Atlantic, you start to see more issues with labor shortages and more transition towards using to investing more in technological developments on outfits, working overtime, and then of course in BC especially, in Quebec and Ontario to a somewhat lesser extent, and Nova Scotia, turning towards temporary foreign workers. So this is what I want to emphasize here is that while temporary foreign workers are a significant part of even prairie agriculture, especially as we'll see here when it comes to food manufacturing, it is more of something that's employed in Quebec, Ontario, and BC, and to a lesser extent out east in the Atlantic. And this will become increasingly relevant when we talk about a post-COVID agricultural economy. The second inclination, again, going back to, we see this drastic decline in labor here on farms. There's about 900,000 people leaving the sector over about a 70-year period. The other instinct is to say, well, why don't we just offer higher wages? Why don't we pay a living wage, is a popular term today, and try to increase the number of domestic employees? That's that blue line right there. I want to emphasize again that that's something that's being done across both the food manufacturing sector as well as crop and animal production. These are dollars adjusted for inflation, but in general, since really the 1980s, well, this figure starts in 1997. Both crop and animal production as well as food manufacturing have offered pretty consistent wage increases across multiple years in an attempt to attract domestic workers. In fact, there's some evidence to show that it's somewhat helped retain the number of workers. This figure right here, the blue line again, when you look at the distribution of workers across the sector, domestic workers actually have been playing a pretty large role in Canadian agriculture, but it hasn't been enough. And so as you see here, since the 1980s, there's been increasing reliance on temporary foreign workers to fill the gap left by small farming families in Canadian agriculture. And this is one thing I want to emphasize, that we often we say, is it a choice between, we present a dichotomy of, is this a choice between domestic workers and foreign workers? The truth of the matter is that foreign workers aren't so much a substitute for domestic workers as they are a substitute for domestic owners leaving the sector. Simple truth is that foreign and domestic workers have responded somewhat differently to wage increases. This shows here the response of TFWs to wage increases offered by employers. In general, when employers offer higher wages, Canadians, those blue dots, haven't necessarily responded in the same way to those wage increases. This might be due to the attractiveness of sectors offering similar wages nearby. It might be due to just simply inability to access those wages. And what I mean by that is a significant portion of our domestic labor force now resides in the cities, and transportation to agricultural outfits might be on the outskirts of cities, or even in more rural locations might be quite difficult, so that even if there is a higher wage increase being offered, the ability for workers to get themselves to the outfit has decreased. And anecdotally, I think this sort of shows a point. I grew up in a small farming community over in eastern British Columbia. Helped out on a farm myself, often as hired farm labor, and it was very common that even when you had employees, those employees were usually the sons and daughters, other workers from your neighbors. You would offer to help, you'd pay them a wage to come onto your farm for a short period. And with the exit of those families, even when looking for hired labor, it can be very difficult, even when you're offering higher wages, if simply there aren't enough families in the area. Whereas when a higher wage has been attractive to TFWs. And I want to emphasize here that when you look at this within Canadian agriculture policy, the federal government does ask that employers do offer the prevailing wage in their region to both domestic and employees first before they hire TFWs. And what I mean by prevailing wage is not the minimum wage, but sort of the average wage for that region. And then if they can show that they've done a certain number of interviews, made a certain number of job offers, that they still can't fill their labor force, that's when they can offer the job to a TFW. So employers are offering higher wages. The domestic labor force isn't responding, but the TFWs are. So again, capital investment has been a big part of this, been a big part of responding to the labor shortage. Higher wages have been a big part of responding to the labor shortage. But the ones that respond to those higher wages have been primarily foreign workers as opposed to domestic employees. Key takeaway as we move into the next section here. Let's talk about how if foreign workers are such a major part of fulfilling the labor gap in our agriculture sector and food manufacturing sector, what have we done to protect them, and how do we transition out of this pandemic? Well, when you understand that creating safe arrival times for TFWs in the next season is going to be very important. There's no way we can immediately shift from using TFWs or employing TFWs. And we need to ensure that when they do begin to arrive, and while that seems maybe we're already talking about next season, I should point out that the arrival of TFWs really does begin in January for the next coming season. Break time for those in food processing and food production, it may be December, January, but already in February we're talking about seeding again. We're talking about coming up on calving, and of course the workers and employees needed to do those things. They do begin arriving during that time. So We need to consider safe testing, arrival, and housing for TFWs, and there have been some policies that have been done to do that. In BC, the BC model has begun to be adapted more readily across Canada, is where the BC government has partnered with producers to say that they would share the costs of hotels and housing and isolation for workers when they first arrive in Canada, as well as isolating workers who have been infected with COVID-19. Rapid testing at airports, I think, will be a major part in ensuring the safe arrival of TFWs in the coming season. But we need to say that they are a critical part of our sector, and that that there need to be steps we need to take to ensure their arrival, and that we can't necessarily, even into the next season, necessarily cut off this important source of labor. Next section we're going to consider, what does a world without TFWs look like? So this is the short term. Short term, describing the steps that have been taken to protect the lives of TFWs. Again, that's that private-public partnership to ensure the safe housing and arrival of TFWs. I should also mention right here is that agri-insurance has been expanded in Ontario and another province to cover labor shortages. So for that, producers who were not able to obtain a sufficient number of workers this year are able to support themselves through the next season, when hopefully a safe and more orderly arrival of TFWs will be able to be ensured. But now we want to consider maybe the long term. What does a world with TFWs without TFWs look like? Maybe one thing we might want to consider is reducing or eliminating the TFW program in the long term to rely on more domestic labor, to rely on more domestic, more of a domestic workforce, or even changing what the agricultural sector looks like in Canada. I want to stay up front that I'm not sure that a world without TFWs is necessarily feasible for various reasons, but I think it is an idea worth exploring because it helps us understand the various policy alternatives out there. So first off, we need to consider, what do we do with the TFWs that currently exist? Short term, we want to consider a pathway to permanent residency for those who've been here for a number of years, who've come for repeat seasons. We want to consider that, given their long time employment in Canada, that helping them become permanent residents with a pathway to Canadian citizenship might be something worthwhile. And I mention that both because I think it's when we talk even just about the ethics, and sometimes we shy away from talking about ethics and public policy, we might want to consider that might just be the right thing to provide permanent residency to TFWs who've come for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seasons in a row. Also, we want to consider, even if we leave aside the question of ethics here, we talk about the question of good public policy. Might want to consider that providing existing TFWs a pathway to permanent residency helps prevent them from falling through the cracks, losing their status, and to be blunt, working illegally in Canada as well. If we suddenly cut off the program without a sort of a ramp off the program, we risk creating an underground workforce, as we see in the United States, with all of the problems associated with that in terms of health of workers, labor rights for the workers, displacing local labor, etc. By and large, we have a TFW workforce that's working legally in Canada, and if we are going to transition off of using TFWs, we want to consider what that pathway looks like. So, having talked about that, what does the transition for industry look like? Well, first off, we want to consider, should there be support for wage subsidies? Do we want to make domestic labor the pillar of Canadian agriculture again? Do we want to really go all in on hiring local? I put there right away that might be problematic. The big reason, again, is that we're going to go back to this right here, is that if you look at those, again, these blue dots, even as wage increases have occurred as you go right on the horizontal axis, we've still seen a decline in the domestic labor force. So I'm not sure. Wage subsidies tends to be the most prominent suggestion I've seen out there in terms of encouraging more workers. Raising the minimum wage floor has been another possibility. The whole idea is that if we just make wages more attractive for domestic workers, that we will be able to hire more off-farm labor to come work in food production and food manufacturing. again, I don't know if that's the problem, in which case we might want to consider our transportation infrastructure, the structure of our cities, etc. One alternative is to transition industry into the city. You sometimes see this idea of an urban agricultural sector or urban farming. There's I think there's certainly value in exploring how we can reform various land use regulations, as well as other regulatory barriers to consider urbanization. We'll get to that here in a second. But again, I don't know if that will address necessarily the problem of just the scale and industrial nature of a Canadian agriculture. And I don't know if we can necessarily transition as easily to an urbanized agricultural sector here that meets the level of export and domestic consumption that we currently have here in Canada. And then finally, want to talk about capital investment in Canada as well. Do we go all in on mechanization of Canadian agriculture? And I put industries here because the question is, do we go all in on mechanizing one Canadian agricultural sector or various sectors? Because one thing I'll point out here is that mechanization is going to look different based on the type of food production going on. So first off, urbanization. I want to talk about the barriers that we'll need to reform there if we want an urban agricultural sector to be something that we want to consider here in Canada. First big barrier is that small urban farms are unlikely to produce at the scale needed for domestic consumption and export. If we consider for whatever reason that domestic consumption and export is not important to us, that we are fine with a certain level of imported food, or not really being an export-oriented agricultural sector, then that might be fine. But small urban farms are might have important aspects for food resiliency, diversity of food among various neighborhoods, and as well as mental and social health benefits for those participating in such outfits. But the reality is they're not going to meet our current level of domestic consumption and export. Two, we want to consider reforming regulatory barriers to the use of common inputs in urban settings. There are a lot of inputs into agriculture, fertilizer, pesticides, etc., that while they are safe for human consumption, given sort of a certain period after they've been used and monitored and sort of degraded, that use of them or employment of them in an urban setting will be very difficult to overcome, sometimes for very good public health reasons, that you don't necessarily want to employ these in a highly dense area. I think the biggest barrier, however, will be land use regulation. I'm going to show you a map right here. These are maps of 5 of our major metropolitan centers here in Canada: Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, and Edmonton. And the red area here shows areas that are zoned only for residential areas and only for single-family detached houses. The blue shows multi-unit residential structures. Big thing I want to emphasize here is that if you want urban farming to be a major reform to address sort of a world without TFWs or a post-COVID world, that there will need to be major land use reform at both the municipal level and the provincial level. This is not something that's necessarily federal jurisdiction, but something that is in the hand of municipal governments, and to a lesser extent provincial governments as well. So there need to be major reforms there to allow more agricultural enterprise in these areas. So we're going to transition now here to finally talk about the major part of our presentation today, which is mechanization. What does a highly mechanized, highly efficient Canadian agricultural sector look like in Canada? I want to emphasize that this is a working paper, and while we do expect it to be released fairly soon, there are parts that we're still sorting out here. So again, any feedback that viewers might have is more than welcome, and my contact information is available at policyschool.ca. This right here shows a substitution of labor to capital. This is Canada-wide, but our early analysis shows that a 1% decrease in the availability in the labor force, or sorry, 1% change in the labor force is equal roughly to about a 2.5 to 3% increase in capital investment. Put another way, that a 1% decrease in our labor force is equal to about a shift to would need to equal a shift in about $6.1 billion in capital investments. Last year, and by the way, I'm going to actually jump forward here. This is fairly consistent across provinces, but as I'll touch on in a second, it's not necessarily equally distributed across provinces. What I want to say though, and this is subject to further analysis, is that if we were to completely close off our TFW program tomorrow, if we were to say next year we are not going to allow any temporary farm workers into Canada, it would equal about the equivalent about a 23% decrease in our agricultural labor force. If you just look at paid employees, if you take out employers, if you take out small farmers, if you just look at those who are working on farms, using their social insurance number as a paid employee, receiving CPP deductions, etc. TFWs account for about half of the Canadian agricultural workforce now, the paid workforce. So that number might sound shocking, a 23% decrease of our agricultural workforce, but that's the number as it currently stands. And what that would mean is that if we were to then try to substitute all of that lost labor for purely mechanized, it would cost an upfront about, give or take, $138 to $140 billion shift towards capital investment in Canada. It would be a significant part of our GDP per year to make that shift. It would require a almost complete overhaul of what agriculture looks like in Canada. And while I think we need to absolutely consider technological improvements, especially around efficiency on farms and the environment on farms, I just want to emphasize how big of a shift we're asking for if we were to completely eliminate the use of temporary foreign workers on farms. That's just cost, and of course that doesn't necessarily consider right up front the loss in productivity that would come from farms while we were making this shift. I just want to emphasize that we would need to offset that loss of temporary foreign workers just in terms of the value they add to Canadian agriculture with about an investment of about $140 billion. So let's say we decide to do that, and let's say it's the federal government or the provincial governments that decide to foot the bill for this. I want to emphasize that shift would not be distributed equally across provinces, because of course Canadian agriculture doesn't look the same across provinces. Right here, what I really want to emphasize, while there is the slope of this shift would look largely similar in each province, right away, one thing that what we point out here is that this shift would be more weighted heavily on places like Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia, and to a lesser extent the prairie provinces. Right here, what this can show on this figure, the steeper Quebec slope, what that shows that a loss of temporary foreign workers would be would entail a stronger shift towards capital investment in Canada or in Quebec, to a lesser extent in Ontario, and even more so in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. BC actually looks fairly similar to Quebec and Ontario. And what I emphasize here is that the loss of TFWs by province would be more of a central Canadian thing, as well as a West Coast thing, and not that the funds needed to do this would be distributed in those areas rather than necessarily the middle part of Canada, the prairies. And this makes sense when you look again at TFW numbers. The use of TFWs really is, while we do employ them here in Alberta, especially in food manufacturing related to beef and poultry, the employment of TFWs really is an endeavor that's very specific to Ontario and Quebec. For the very last part of my presentation here, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. I want to emphasize that as well, is that this is a sector that would heavily favor greenhouses and nurseries and floriculture. These are jobs, when you look at jobs by industry, the blue line shows greenhouse and yellow shows food manufacturing, whereas orange and gray show other crop production and animal production. TFWs are heavily concentrated in food manufacturing and greenhouse, nurseries, and floriculture. And so that any such program that would consider the employment of TFWs in these sectors would be the investment need will go heavily to those provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and BC, and would go to necessarily more than anything the greenhouse, nursery, and floriculture sector, and to a lesser extent tree and fruit as well as vegetables and melons. Animal production would be somewhat left out from such an endeavor of shifting away from TFWs. Whereas if we want to consider mechanization related mechanization and more efficiency in those sectors, we need to consider a program that isn't necessarily attached to the employment of temporary foreign workers in those sectors. We're coming up on the end of the presentation here. We had a few less slides there, but those are more just talking points for myself. Big thing I want to emphasize here is that TFWs are a major part of Canadian agriculture. They replace the loss of small farmers and workers in Canada. Urbanization and domestic employees aren't necessarily going to be the answers in a post-TFW world. And while capital investment can be, we need to be careful and not necessarily attaching it to the employment of TFWs in various sectors, because otherwise we end up favoring specific provinces as well as specific parts of the agricultural sector as well. Hope to make this a big part of our next upcoming paper, and happy to entertain questions and points raised here on those, but we look forward to its release and look forward to providing more details on what a post-COVID, post-TFW world looks like, and how capital investment could benefit the sector, but also the areas we need to be careful with. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Robert. That was a great presentation. We already have some great Q&A questions coming in here. I'm going to start right into it. And the first one is, do you have comments on your estimated impact of the current Alberta government restrictions on TFW entry?
Yeah, I'll stick specifically to agriculture on here. One thing that's noteworthy, this is not heavy or controversial speculation on my end, but I do think it's one to consider. They're actually, interestingly enough, the recent announcement was actually not the original plan announcement. There was actually going to be an announcement months ago around a reduction in the number of TFWs coming to Canada, as well as a reduction in the number of spots offered for Alberta's immigration program. Alberta can, by the way, sponsor a certain number of immigrants per year for permanent residency. I suspect that earlier announcement was going to be far more restrictive on the arrival of TFWs, especially as it relates to agriculture. It was going to be somewhat similar to the New Brunswick model. Early on in the pandemic, New Brunswick restricted the entry of TFWs in the program, and in the province, and they very quickly had to lift that restriction because they caused a major labor shortage in its seafood manufacturing sector. What I'll say succinctly here is that there are a lot of exemptions written into the Alberta recent decision by the Alberta government, such that I don't think it will have a major impact on Albertan agriculture, simply because TFWs in Alberta are exempted under those rules. So if a farmer, if a food processing plant wants to hire a temporary farm worker, they still can, and they still can arrive in Canada, subject to, of course, all the provincial and federal travel restrictions and public health regulations as well.
And the next question here is, has the use of temporary foreign workers shifted the relative economics of large to small scales, and thus is one driver or several of the reduction in the number of family farms and the poor economics of small processing plants?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. There's a lot contained in there. I'll try to answer it very succinctly. I'm going to actually, if you want more context on the driver behind the exit of small families from the sector, it actually started with post-World War II policy. That put very, very shortly, because I know there are questions here and we have limited time. What it did is it enabled farming families who wanted to exit the sector to actually sell their farms to larger producers who received government financing in order to sell their farms and move to more the suburbia, as it were. But on the flip side, there was government financing post World War II for large outfits to actually purchase those. So there was basically, if you wanted to exit the sector, there was financing to do that. If you wanted to grow in the sector, there was financing to do that as well. That's where the trend really started. and since then as well, I actually do agree that I think that efficiency in food processing has been an issue. If a farmer can't necessarily get their product to market through the food processing system, it can be quite difficult for them to go on season after season. So I think that certainly it started with post-World War II policy. That obviously we can't continue to say that's an influence, but it's certainly that started the trend. And then efficiency in our food processing sector, I think, has been an exacerbator, as it were.
So we got time for a couple quick questions here. Are TFWs in the agricultural equipment manufacturing sector also accounted for in your statistics?
Yes, we will go into more details in those as well. I think when we talk about TFWs in agriculture, we tend to think about farmers in fields, and we tend to think of TFWs in fields and orchards. But I want to emphasize, kind of as going back to the beginning, that they are playing a very large and increasing role in our food manufacturing sector as well. And if we want to cut off the TFW program as well, for the agriculture sector, that's going to have a downstream impact on our food manufacturing sector as well.
So without TFWs, would our ag be globally competitive?
I would say no. And actually, one thing that we'll go into in the paper is the value add from temporary foreign workers, especially when it comes to our greenhouse, nursery, and floriculture sectors. We have almost doubled the number of greenhouse and nursery related jobs in just the past 3 or 4 years alone. And this sector has actually grown considerably and almost doubled in its productivity in the past number of years. And so as far as export goes, and even as far as domestic consumption goes, a large part is actually, by the way, being driven by local demand for vegetables and fruit throughout the year. TFWs make our domestic markets more competitive, and they make our international markets more competitive as well.
And do other first world countries with significant agricultural sectors, so i.e. the Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, etc., employ similar numbers of temporary foreign workers?
Australia, New Zealand, yes. Netherlands is a bit different. It's hard to call them necessarily temporary foreign workers when a big part of the European market is, of course, part of the single labor market as well. So even though foreign workers are coming from places like Romania and Bulgaria, they have all the rights that a permanent resident would have in those countries. Well, although I should say a lot of them do actually. When we talk about TFWs, when we talk about permanent residency for TFWs, we need to consider that a large number of them actually do want to go home to their home countries at the end of the season. Large part because a large number of them are actually farmers in their home countries, and their off season is our on season, as it were, and they want to come up here, make some money, then go back and invest that in their farms. So New Zealand, Australia, yes. The European situation is a little bit different.
Okay. And one last question here. Do you see any indication that new immigrants who have not yet found permanent jobs are willing to take the temporary jobs which had been filled by TFWs?
So yes and no. It's a bit complicated. The interesting story here is we have to be careful with immigration programs that are specifically dedicated towards agriculture. We've tried that in the past, and what we've seen actually, I laugh because my wife's grandparents came under this program as well, a refugee program designed to put refugees into Canadian agriculture. They stayed for a 1-year contract in the agricultural sector and then moved on to more urban oriented jobs. So yes, there is some indication that they could be there at least temporarily. The biggest example I use is that within our transportation sector, we have a high turnover rate, as it were, of TFWs transitioning to permanent residency. And we've been actually able to maintain a large number of those workers in transportation. And retain, actually, by the way, the supply of foreign workers in transportation as well. We just had to understand that with a permanent residency program, there will be some turnover where maybe after a couple of seasons that it's likely that worker will move on to maybe a more urban oriented job. I think we froze here. I don't know if it's me or if it's Kara. Kara. Oh no, your audio's cut out. The big technical difficulty. I'll mute myself. I'll let you close off, assuming that's what you're doing here.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I don't know what happened. Welcome to the world of rural internet. So if anyone's listening that could fix rural internet, please fix it. Thank you. But that was a great presentation, Robert. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you everyone who submitted questions. We really, really appreciate it. Please keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email. You'll be getting this webinar. So if there's anything you feel like you missed that you want to go back and listen to, absolutely, you'll be able to do that. And if you haven't registered to join us next week, December 3rd, can't believe next week is somehow December 3rd already, but we're there. You'll hear from Dr. Yemin Foley, Dr. Roland Kribble, and Dr. Margot Hubert, who will be they'll be talking about the carbon footprint of various foods and how to reduce the carbon footprint of your dinner. It might be a heated debate, so it'll definitely be one you want to tune into. Thanks again, everyone, for joining in. We appreciate it very, very much. And thank you, Robert, for your time. We look forward to seeing how this paper turns out.